Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. And welcome to another episode of Felonious Females, the podcast series that explores the lives, crimes, punishments, and remarkable legacies of women caught up in the justice system of the past. In 1834, Mary Stewart, her husband John, and their young daughter Rachael stood together before a Yorkshire court, convicted of theft and sentenced to transportation to New South Wales. Separated by the convict system and sent on different ships, their story became one of hardship, resilience, and unanswered questions. What happened to a child transported across the world? Did the family ever reunite? And why do we find mother and daughter appearing in court records again years later in the Hunter Valley? Join Mel Woodford as she traces the remarkable journey of the Stewart family from Scotland and Yorkshire to colonial Australia. This is A Family Affair.
1834 was not a good year for the Stewart family, originally from Dundee in Scotland. On the 10th of April, mother, father and daughter were sentenced to transportation at York, Kingston upon Hull quarter sessions. The Hull Packet newspaper reported the next day that
Mary Stewart, 45, Rachael Stewart, 10, and John Stewart, 30, charged with stealing on the 18th of January one piece of print, the property of Mr. Anthony Eastwood, pleaded guilty. The prisoners also pleaded guilty to another indictment for stealing on the same day one piece of silk, the property of Messrs. Rhodes and Rutherford. There was a third indictment against them, upon which no evidence was offered. The court ordered John Stewart and Mary Stewart to be transported for 14 years, and the girl, Rachael Stewart, for 7 years, in order that she might be removed to the penitentiary.
this was not the first time the three had been before the court. The York Herald had reported on the 13th of April the previous year that
Mary Stewart, 40, and Rachael Stewart, her daughter aged only 10, were charged with having stolen a piece of printed cotton, the property of Mr. Crummock, of Castlegate, linen draper. John Stewart, aged 30, stood charged with having received the same, knowing it to have been stolen. Mr. Bliss stated the case. On the night of Saturday, the 2nd of February last, the two female prisoners went to the shop of the prosecutor and looked at some goods. Soon after their departure, Mr. Crummock missed about 21 yards of print. On the morning of the following Monday, the prosecutor saw the prisoners pass his shop. He immediately applied to Robinson, assistant police officer, who followed them to Castle Mills Bridge, where he apprehended them. On taking off the male prisoner's hat, the print was found. On being called on for their defence, the man and wife declared that they had purchased the piece of print and paid for it. The jury found them guilty and acquitted the child. The court sentenced the father and mother to be confined to hard labour for the space of 9 calendar months.
one wonders what happened to Rachael during that time. After the most recent conviction, John was transported on the Henry Tanner, which sailed from Woolwich on the 1st of July 1834. Mary and Rachael were transported on the George Hibbert, which left the Downs in south-eastern England on the 27th of that same month. The ship Henry Tanner arrived in Port Jackson on October 26th, after a voyage of some 117 days. John Stewart does not appear on Surgeon John Edwards' sick list for having been treated during the journey. Once landed, the 220 male convicts were assigned to their various masters or to government service. Unlike Rachael and Mary, John does not appear to have come to the Hunter Valley, which begs the question, did he ever see his wife and daughter again? We do catch sight of him in 1840, when he gains his ticket of leave to stay in the district of Wellington, New South Wales, and again in 1849 when he receives his certificate of freedom. Mother and daughter joined 142 other female convicts, a number of free passengers and numerous children from different counties on board the George Hibbert between the 3rd and the 17th of July, in readiness to set sail from Woolwich on the 27th. Their journey lasted 127 days, and although not severe, a number of women experienced dyspepsia, catarrh and bowel complaints, in addition to some mild cases of scurvy towards the end of the voyage. The surgeon, John Tarn, did his best to ensure that disease was kept to a minimum by maintaining sanitary conditions. This included such activities as the airing of bed linen, the scrubbing of sleeping areas, keeping the women's quarters as dry as possible with the use of stoves, and allowing the women on deck whenever conditions permitted. Amongst the free passengers on board we find Mrs. Saunders, wife of the Reverend John Saunders, who was employed as the first matron on a convict ship. This was the result of communications between social and prison reformer Mrs. Elizabeth Fry, the Ladies' British Society for Promoting the Reformation of Female Prisoners, founded by Mrs. Fry in 1821, and the British government. Mrs. Saunders, although frequently suffering from seasickness, did her very best to tend to the needs of the female convicts with the help of her husband. The George Hibbert arrived in Port Jackson on the 1st of December 1834 with no loss of life. A muster was taken on board before the female convicts were taken ashore some days later. The convict indents provide us with a considerable amount of information about each woman. We learn, for instance, that Mary Stewart was 5 foot tall and stout with a sallow and pock-pitted complexion, grey eyes and grey hair, although her details in the Newcastle Jail descriptions books differ somewhat, giving her hair colour as black. We are also told that she was Protestant and could read. Her usual calling was housemaid or maid of all work. Rachael Stewart is described as being 4 foot 2 inches tall, with a ruddy and pock-pitted complexion, light hair and grey eyes. We are told that she was Protestant and could read. The fact that both mother and daughter could read may have been due to the ministrations of the Reverend and Mrs. Saunders during the long voyage. Unfortunately, we are not provided with a list of assignments for the women of the George Hibbert. Some would have been assigned straight from the ship, and those with children would most likely have been taken to the Parramatta Female Factory. Some women may have had family already in the colony and been assigned to them. We do know from the Sydney Gazette of Thursday the 15th of January 1835, just 1 month after they landed, that many of the women fell foul of the law shortly after arrival.
The female prisoners who lately arrived per George Hibbert seemed fully equal to the task of rivalling in bad conduct those renowned damsels who arrived in the colony a few years ago by the Roslyn Castle and Lucy Davidson, and who were so noted at the time for their bad behaviour. Scarce a day passes without a batch of George Hibberts being placed at the bar of the Sydney Police.
Mary was initially assigned to Andrew Drysdale, a mariner and later a sea captain based in Sydney, and then to John Howe in Newcastle in 1839. It is interesting to note that one John Cooper had arrived on the Parmelia in 1832 and had also been assigned to John Howe. Was this perhaps how John met Mary's daughter Rachael? In May 1842, John, aged 33, and Rachael, aged 20 years according to the records, which can sometimes be inconsistent, applied to the Reverend Rusden of East Maitland for permission to marry. This was duly granted. Did they ever marry, though? Cooper had been granted a ticket of leave for the Maitland area in 1841, but this was cancelled in December 1842 for drunkenness. He was again granted a ticket of leave in 1843, but this time for the district of Patrick's Plains. By 1847, Cooper had a ticket of leave for the district of Windsor, where he applied to marry one Margaret Flanagan, who had arrived on board the Isabella. We find reference to Mary Stewart in the Newcastle Jail entry and description books on the 1st of November 1839, charged with drunkenness and incarcerated for 14 days. But the next we hear of Rachael is in the Christchurch Newcastle Marriage Register, where we find an entry in January 1843 for a marriage between a Rachael Stewart, 21, and a John Christian, 23, both said to have arrived in the colony free. We can reasonably assume that this is our Rachael, for reasons which will become clear shortly. In July 1844, we find a baptism for a son, John James, while the couple was living in Newcastle. On the 29th of October 1853, the New South Wales Births, Deaths and Marriages confirms the birth of Anne in Maitland and Elizabeth in Newcastle in 1857, amongst others. John Christian was no stranger to the wrong side of the law, having allegedly deserted the crew of a convict ship once it arrived in Sydney and made his way north to Newcastle on a small schooner. He managed to avoid capture until the ship had left port. He was then arrested and imprisoned in Newcastle jail after being sentenced to 2 years for desertion. He served only half this sentence before being released, following the intervention of some of the local settlers on his behalf. He made his way to Maitland, where he found employment with gentleman John Smith. The Sydney Morning Herald of Friday the 8th of October 1852, in a column headed Maitland Quarter Sessions, continues the story.
Mary Stewart was indicted for stealing 31 yards of plaid, the property of William Patey Peake, at Maitland on the 28th of August 1852. The prisoner pleaded guilty and was remanded for sentence. John Christian and Rachael Christian were indicted for stealing 7 yards of carpet, the property of Edward Ogg, and 10 yards of plaid, 10 yards of doeskin, and 10 yards of tweed, the property of William Patey Peake at Maitland on the 1st of September 1852. In a second count, they were charged with receiving the goods. Mr. Purefoy appeared for the defence and witnesses were called. The particulars of this case were reported in the Mercury quite recently, on the committal of the prisoners for trial. The witnesses were closely examined with the view to trace the actual taking to the old woman, Mary Stewart, the mother of the female prisoner and who had pleaded guilty as above to a similar charge. Mr. Purefoy requested the court to reserve 2 points, one that there was no legal evidence to bring home possession to the prisoners, and the other that there was no proof of guilty knowledge. Mr. Purefoy then addressed the jury in defence, and the Crown Prosecutor having replied, the jury retired for above an hour and returned with a verdict against the male prisoner of guilty. They acquitted the female prisoner, believing her to have acted under the control of her husband. She was discharged and Christian was remanded for sentence, and the following Tuesday sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment in Maitland Jail.
A more detailed account may be found in the Maitland Mercury of Saturday, September 11th. We are able to follow Mary Stewart via occasional court reports in newspapers. We know she gained her ticket of leave in March 1842 for the district of Maitland. This was later changed to Merton in July of 1847. We also know that she was sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment in November of 1858. We do not find mention of Mary after this. We come across the name John Christian, free settler, in a number of contexts, leading us to believe that there was more than one man known by this name in the Hunter Valley during the time frame in question. It is occasionally quite easy to eliminate a particular man from our research, as we're given the name of his wife or other information which identifies him easily as a different John Christian. For this reason, only those men mentioned in association with a Mary Stewart or a Rachael Stewart who arrived aboard the George Hibbert in 1834 have been included in this narrative. The final piece of our puzzle comes in the form of an obituary in the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate, dated Monday the 27th of February 1899, entitled Lambton, Death of an Old Resident.
Mr. John J. Christian, one of the oldest residents of the Newcastle district, died at his daughter's residence, Deviter Street, on Friday night. Deceased was born on the Isle of Man in 1808 and was one of the crew of a vessel that landed in Sydney with a consignment of convicts for the penal settlement in the year 1827. On the ship's arrival at Circular Quay, he deserted and came to Newcastle in a small schooner, eluding capture until this ship had left Australia. He was subsequently arrested and sentenced to 2 years' jail for desertion and confined in the old jail on the hill, where he had practical experience of the barbarous prison system of those days. After serving about 12 months of his sentence, The free selectors, who had always regarded his punishment as unduly severe, especially so to a young man only 19 years of age, were successful in their petitions for a remission of his sentence, and he was released. Shortly after he regained his liberty, he went to live at Maitland and was employed for a number of years by a man known as Gentleman Smith. Meanwhile, he saved sufficient to purchase a wagon and a team of horses, which enabled him to follow the occupation of a teamster for the greater part of his life. He took up his residence in Adamstown in 1858, and with the exception of a flying visit to the Tambaroora diggings, did not leave the district again. Deceased was a man of a very robust constitution, and until about 7 years ago enjoyed excellent health, notwithstanding the hardships and exposure of his early colonial experience. At that date, his eyesight began to fail, and he was compelled to relinquish his work as a carter. One by one, his other faculties failed him, and the body, also becoming weakened, he was confined to his bed about 6 weeks ago, and notwithstanding the careful nursing of his aged wife and daughter, Mrs. Dorber, he gradually sank and peacefully passed away on Friday night at the age of 91 years. He was the father of 13 children, 8 of whom are now living. There is much sympathy in the community for his surviving widow, children, and 44 grandchildren.
John's wife of 56 years, Rachael Stewart Christian, followed her husband to the grave only 4 months later. She is also buried in the primitive Methodist section of Sandgate Cemetery, together with other family members. Descendants of the couple still walk the streets of Newcastle.
The story of Mary and Rachael Stewart shows that convict history is about far more than crime and punishment. It is about families, survival, and the lives built after transportation. Although many questions remain unanswered, we do know that Rachael went on to raise a large family in the Newcastle district, leaving a legacy that continues today. Thank you for listening to Felonious Females, and look out for other fascinating stories of the women who found their way to Newcastle and the Hunter Valley on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.